Welcome to all those joining us from around the country, as well as to our panellists, for what I know will be a very interesting discussion on how we should be combating online hate. This is the first time that the Board of Deputies has ever hosted a fringe event at a Labour Party conference, albeit a virtual event. And it is particularly poignant because over the last few years, the relationship between the Labour Party and the Jewish community has reached its lowest ebb, with anti-Semitism running virtually unchecked in the party and its former leader either incapable or unwilling to tackle the problem. However, as we are all aware, the Labour Party is under new management and now has a leader who has done more, let's be frank, to combat anti-Semitism in the past 5 months than his predecessor did in the previous 5 years. We believe that Keir Starmer has made a strong start to fixing the problem, but there is still clearly a long way to go. I know that all true anti-racists in the Labour Party, as well as the Jewish community, are waiting for the release of the EHRC report on anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, not just to see what the report contains, but also to see and understand how the Labour Party and its leadership will respond to it. The Board of Deputies' 10 pledges, to which both Keir and the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, signed up to, is a roadmap for fixing the problem. And it's had an effect. The pledges addresses the processes, the education, and most importantly, the culture that Labour needs to understand and work with and drive forwards that will make Labour once more a safe space for our community. And that is another reason why we believe that this event is important. Much of the abuse and hate and denial of abuse and hate, which both individual Jews and the community as a whole have suffered over the last few years, happened in the online sphere. But of course, the problem of hate on social media goes far more wider than anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Whether because of someone's race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation, hate seems to be an accepted part of online life these days, and it should not be this way. Online is the new front line in the fight against racism, and there are a number of tools that we can bring to that fight. This conversation is particularly timely because the government is currently looking at bringing forward its online harms bill, with a government response expected in the coming weeks before a bill comes before Parliament in the new year. We need this to be a bold step in the fight against racism and not a missed opportunity. At the Board of Deputies, we believe there are 3 key steps which need to be taken. First, with regard to anti-Semitism, in particular, one of the repeated problems that we face is that social media companies quibble over the definition of anti-Semitism with loose language in their respective community standards. In recent years, we have also had this problem in the Labour Party and on university campuses and also in local councils. Part of the solution in these and other cases has been the adoption of an agreed definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition. Similarly, we think that social media companies should be required to adopt the full IRA definition as part of their community guidelines. This could happen by the new regulator for social media adopting it as the standard by which they will judge whether social media companies are discharging their obligations around the safety of Jewish users. Secondly, and this is more generic to racism and prejudice in various forms, we would recommend that social media companies be required to have a minimum number of staff involved in enforcement in the UK to deal with complaints involving UK users. We think a UK team will have a better grasp of the political, cultural, and linguistic issues specific to the UK, which may be driving prejudice, than would, for example, someone in a country with a different culture or even a different dialect of English where slang or offensive terms could differ. We believe that compelling companies to have monitoring teams in the UK would also make it easier for government and civil society to hold social media companies to account. Thirdly, it has sadly become clear over recent years that social media companies will ultimately only act when their bottom line is at risk. This is why we have come to the conclusion to get real change, the government should follow the German model of introducing heavy fines for social media companies who fail to enforce the agreed standards sufficiently, robustly, or quickly. It is interesting to note that in Germany, despite various protestations by social media companies, they appear to miraculously find ways to make it work when heavy fines come into effect. We believe that Labour, with its highly publicised problems regarding online hate, is potentially in a strong position to point to its own experiences as proof of the need for stronger action in this area, and, as it works to get its own house in order, encourage the government to take a firm stand on this issue. I will now hand over to Gillian Merron, our Chief Executive, to introduce the panellists and initiate what I know will be a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Gillian.
Thanks for your words and welcome, Marie. And I also add my warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today. As Marie said, we've got an excellent panel to discuss an issue of real importance. And I'm going to provide a brief introduction to every one of our panelists today. First of all, Ruth Smeeth. Ruth is the former Labour MP for Stoke-on-Trent North. She served there from 2015 to 2019. And during this time, we knew her to be passionate and dedicated in taking forward the fight against anti-Semitism, not least because sadly she herself was a major target of anti-Semitic and misogynistic abuse. Ruth now serves as Chief Executive for the Index on Censorship. We are also joined today by David Lammy, MP for Nottingham and Tottenham. And I moved you to the East Midlands there, David. David is also the Shadow Justice Secretary. It's no secret that sadly Black politicians have been particularly targeted online by despicable racists, and David himself has been the target of many such attacks. Prior to becoming an MP, David was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn at the age of 22. Thanks for joining us, David. And last but absolutely not least, Nick Thomas-Symonds, the MP for Torvine and the Shadow Home Secretary. Nick has, as part of his brief, doubtlessly seen many examples of how people are using the online sphere to spread messages of hate. Nick was also called to the bar in 2004. So let's start by inviting each of our panelists to talk about their personal experience of online hate. And I'm going to start with Ruth. So Ruth, over to you.
Good afternoon and thank you. I'm something of an expert, as it turns out, not something I thought I'd be saying 5 years ago. First of all, I want to thank the board for this conversation. It's incredibly important. But I also want to make it clear that online hate comes in many different forums. And the reason why anti-Semitism specifically became such an issue for the Labour Party last year, over the last several years, is because the abuse came from within our movement. It wasn't that the abuse was new. It wasn't that the abuse was different or more important than any other form of racism. It's not. It's just that for me specifically, the abuse I received overwhelmingly came from within the Labour movement and from within the Labour Party and wasn't dealt with or acted upon. I just want to give a couple of examples because I think that, especially for David and I, we could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours, and it's not very cheerful listening or speaking because it was our lived experience and it is still our lived experience. And when you're talking about these issues, it's like you're giving a voice to those people who have spent hours and hours trying to take away our voices or demean our voices or to push us into a box. But for me, I'd always had experienced a level of anti-Semitism. Before I was elected, I worked for Hope Not Hate, and it was, in my world, I knew I was doing the right thing if it was the far right that were giving me a hard time about being Jewish. It was the right people who hated me. Everything changed for me quite quickly in 2016 when there was an investigation into what was happening at Oxford Union Labour Club. At that point, I was on the Parliamentary Labour Party's Executive Committee, and I would meet with the leader of the Labour Party every week, and I would raise it with him every week. I begged for this issue to go away. Not one of us wanted to talk about racism within our own movement. We were desperate for this not to be an issue. That led to the Royal Report and then ultimately the Chakrabarti Report, of which I think everyone on this call will have their own views and positions on. At the launch of Chakrabarti's report, there was an incident of anti-Semitism, much more than is covered by a 20-second clip. Regardless of what happens at the event or not, what that then led to for me was a huge amount of abuse that weekend. 25,000 pieces of abuse, not all of it anti-Semitic, some of it misogynist, some of it just normal abuse that apparently goes with being a politician. There was also a huge amount of hope and of positive well wishes within it. But it is always the hate that you focus on. And from a personal point of view, the bit I don't want to give voice to any of the people who have written things about me that they've chosen to write. But from a personal point of view, it was when the banter leads to abuse that then leads to threat. And when there is an overwhelming amount of abuse, it's where it's finding the threat becomes difficult. So it's how vulnerable you become as an individual, because finding the threat is challenging. At this point, I need to thank CST because they ended up employing someone to look at my abuse and Luciana's abuse and Louise Ellman's abuse and Margaret Hodges' abuse and Stella Crease's abuse. All because we spoke out on the issues and all because we were Jewish women. And it was the Jewish women rather than the Jewish men who faced this type of abuse. And the real world impact, I just want to give one example that I don't really talk about usually, but I haven't been able to wear my Apple Watch since that weekend. Because when you start getting death threats come through on your wrist and on something that is physical, I have not been able to wear it since, because that was just overwhelming for me. We all deal with this differently. We all deal with this in different ways. David, occasionally, I know, names and shames some of the people who give him his worst abuse, or Justina, oh my God, what is wrong with you people? Luciana did the same. I just couldn't look at it anymore. It was how we all needed to protect our mental health. And fundamentally, we're all human beings. But this has real life consequences. There is a problem. It's just how we go about dealing with the problem. And I just want to remind everybody that because of the nature of social media, very few people can dominate your life and can come straight at you in a way that in any other forum they can't. So social media is specifically unique in this way. I believe I've done my 4 minutes, so over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Ruth. And I don't think any of us could have heard the way you spoke about not being able to look at that Apple Watch without feeling deeply affected by it. So thank you for sharing as you have. David, over to you.
Well, just to say, and thank you, Gillian, that I suspect that if this event is streamed, is watched, you will see people making anti-Semitic remarks, making remarks about me being involved in some sort of conspiracy. And let me be absolutely clear, and it's wonderful when you do events like this, because, you know, I am not a new friend of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. I'm an old friend of the Board of Deputies and British Jews, working together over many, many, many years. And I will not be cowed by the racists and anti-Semites in my party and beyond. I think on a personal level, the things that occur to me are, of course, that this doesn't just affect me individually. To some extent, I've acquired a thicker skin than I might otherwise have had we not got social media. But I am very conscious. I have a 6-year-old daughter. I have teenage sons. I have a wife. I have extended family who are not in the public eye. Many of them are not middle class, actually, and it's important to say that. And I'm really conscious when people abuse me in the way that they do, and I'll just unpick that a bit in a moment, that I'm in a position where lots of people are looking at my feed and are looking at what they say, because I am a figurehead, or one of the figureheads, for a minority community. The Black population in this country is around 3.5% of the country. And when you're a minority community, and our Jewish brothers and sisters know this really, really well, you stand out. And when you speak and when people react to you, the community itself is hugely aware of what you're saying. It's why actually sometimes I challenge the racists, because I'm doing it vicariously on behalf of the security guards, the cleaners, the porters, the bus drivers, the everyday Black people in constituencies like mine that don't get to stand up to the bully because they haven't got the platform that I've got. And they have to experience that everyday racism in a very, very real way. And the reason why I also am prepared to challenge those like Wiley, I'm afraid, who engage in anti-Semitic tropes and draw division, not just within communities, but between communities, is I am also very conscious. My own view is that there has been a long-standing solidarity between those who've been traditionally excluded or oppressed, and a long-standing solidarity between Black communities and Jewish communities. We would not have beaten apartheid in South Africa without the support of the Jewish community working alongside Nelson Mandela, and we would not have King civil rights without that solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters who helped us set up the NAACP in the United States. And it's one of my responsibilities to remind people of that, where there's this ignorance, I'm afraid, creeping in to the national and global conversation. You know, you just have to Google my name and the N-word to see what people say. The death threats are well documented. And the truth is, when I face these people down, and I remember going up to Wolverhampton to sit in a trial of someone who'd sent me and a few other MPs a death threat. And the figure, he was a lonely, pathetic, elderly figure, seduced, frankly, by the extremism that he was coming across in an everyday way on the internet, dragging him in to these cesspool silos of hate. And that's why this topic is so fundamentally important, because it's sort of counter to the huge work of education that anti-racist and anti-Semitic, or not anti-Semitic, sorry, Jewish organizations have done over many, many years to educate people about what it is we're talking about, to come to establish definitions, and then to find yourself in a place where technology and a lack of leadership is dragging people into these holes is just so extremely disheartening, particularly when behind it lies a for-profit motive. So I welcome this discourse, and I'm here very much, not just experiencing it, but in solidarity and very conscious of what it means to be a minority in a European country.
Thank you, David, and your solidarity and support is very appreciated, and particularly from the place where you bring it from. So thank you. And now to Nick. And Nick, of course, all MPs suffer abuse, and you'll have your own reflections on this subject and your own experience, and also a shadow Home Secretary. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Gillian, very much. And I just want to say, first of all, about my admiration, really, for both David and Ruth, for the quite extraordinary courage, and if I may say so, dignity that they both show and have shown in the face of quite appalling abuse. Ruth, who suffered misogynistic and anti-Semitic abuse, and the vile racism that David, frankly, David, is on your feed every day insofar as I can see, and it is utterly appalling and unacceptable. And I just want to say a word really, first of all, particularly to Ruth, because I think she makes a very fair criticism that so much of the abuse she received came from within the Labour movement. And Gillian, and Marie, I've made it a priority for one of my very first meetings as Shadow Home Secretary to be with the Board of Deputies, also been meeting with Gerald Ronson of the Community Security Trust. Keir Starmer said in his acceptance speech he would tear out the poison of anti-Semitism by its roots. But he and I have both said that we don't want to be judged on words, we want to be judged on deeds. And Marie, I know you said that you feel there's a strong start, and I very much appreciate that, but I entirely share your view as well, that there is a long, long way to go. We appreciate that, but we very much want to work with you to make that a reality and continue to work and show by our actions that the Labour movement is going to be a safe space for the Jewish community, and we are absolutely determined to do that. I do regularly look at the Community Security Trust's quite outstanding work, and frankly, I was reading its latest anti-Semitic incidents report. It covers January to June of this year, and frankly, it makes for sobering reading. I mean, 789 anti-Semitic incidents across the UK in the first 6 months. It is the third highest total the CST has picked up in any year. And in particular, there is an issue with instances of anti-Semitism online, a 4% increase from 332 to 344 incidents. And I understand that is the highest number of online incidents ever recorded by the CST in the first half of a year. Now, that is the scale of the challenge we face. And I accept, Labour's responsibility, and I accept my responsibility as Shadow Home Secretary on this, to work with the Jewish community, to work with the Community Security Trust, and to make sure that we change the online space and the online culture of behaviour. We cannot tolerate a situation where there is space for hate online. And too often people, they remain anonymous. They feel they can say things without consequence. They feel that this is a space in which they can voice hatred. And we also know as well that too often the online platforms have been too slow to act, even when something that is so clearly, whether it's racist, whether it's anti-Semitic, misogynist, when we see these things and the terrible abuse, even when any reasonable person looking at that situation would say that's the case. The platforms have been too slow to act. So I'm afraid that I've lost patience with the idea that the internet companies and social media companies can self-regulate. I think the time has come where there has to be regulation. The online harms bill, I hope, will not be kicked into the long grass. We've already offered as a front bench to work constructively with the government to get the legislation right. That is what we will seek to do. But I firmly believe there has to be now a formal legal duty of care, independently regulated. Do what we can as legislators to deal with this terrible abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. And I know that I'm speaking for so many of us in saying how much we appreciate not just what you're doing to make it clear, but actually what you're actually doing to support everybody's work to combat racism, both within the Labour Party, but also in wider society. And as I go on to our next question, Nick, you've already started answering it, but I will put the questions to our panel anyway. I want to go back to something that Marie mentioned earlier, and that's the three main things that at the Board of Deputies we believe are key to confronting online hate. So just to briefly recap for everybody who's listening, the points that we feel are crucial are, first of all, ensuring that any regulator appointed to oversee the social media companies make sure that there is the adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and that will be the standard by which we can judge companies and whether they're discharging their obligations around the safety of Jewish users. Second point is ensuring that social media companies appoint a UK moderating team to moderate users in this country, because we believe that an in-country team will understand the context better than would a team who are based elsewhere. And that, of course, will help with accountability. And the third point that Marie mentioned was in reference to the German model of heavy fines for social media companies for failure to comply with legislation, that should be adopted here as well. So I want to ask whether Labour can get behind these, and I also want to ask the panellists what else they think is needed. And Ruth, when I come to you in due course, I do understand in your role as Chief Executive of Index on censorship that whilst you may not be able to endorse these asks that we are making, but you will be able to, I hope, comment on how one can legislate to protect social media users in a way that doesn't present issues around censorship, and whether that's possible. So I hope that you'll address that. So as Nick had already started, I will come back to Nick for his comments on those areas.
Yes, thank you, Gillian. And I'll come to the three asks in a minute, but they are certainly three things I would be very keen to work with you on, to just say that at the outset. But let me just give you a sense of how I see this working, because, I've been patient on the self-regulation, and in my role, I speak regularly to social media companies, but I do feel, unfortunately, the time has long passed where we could trust self-regulation. So I think we do need a statutory duty of care. I think that then, of course, if there are things that are highlighted to social media companies, they do obviously need a period of time, a reasonable period of time to take them down. But there has to be then an independent regulator to enforce it, and an independent regulator that has teeth. And that relates back to the third point that Marie raised at the outset, where and you're quite right that in Germany, that model of fines has, it seems to me anyway, worked extremely well and is effective. Because what we ultimately want, the policing of good behavior. We cannot have a situation where saying something in the street is treated somehow differently than if you go and say something that's online. The criminal act is the criminal act, the inappropriate act is the inappropriate act. Racism is racism, anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. So we have to do that. Now, on the three specific points, the IHRA definition would seem to me to be a very reasonable thing to put in the community standards. I've had numerous discussions with social media companies about community standards, and I've been extremely unhappy with some of the standards applied. Secondly, I think that staff in the United Kingdom is going to be absolutely important. I think that would apply to a lot of other countries as well, to understand context, localism, all these things really matter if you're going to have an effective, sensitive, targeted means of enforcement. And thirdly, there is no purpose to having an independent regulator that doesn't have teeth. It has to have that power to levy particular penalties when social media companies are simply not doing what they should be. And I say openly, Gillian, today that I've heard Marie set them out, but I'd be very interested in you sending them over to my office and working with you on those things and feeding them into other shadow teams as the online harms bill comes before Parliament.
Thanks, Nick. Consider that done. And David.
Well, look, let me say on those three things, it would be extraordinary not to adopt the definition, frankly. I think it is incredibly difficult to properly police this if you do not have local staff that are culturally aware. Now, one of the things is, very sadly, because of the devastating anti-Semitism that crept into the Labour Party, the majority that the government now have is significant. We will do what we can as an opposition, but clearly the key to this is in that online's white paper, which has not yet come forward, despite the urgency and the seriousness of these issues. Nick's absolutely right about self-regulation. We've got to get serious about this. And of course, we note that in Australia, they've gone down the road of fines. And in Germany, they've gone down the roads of serious fines. So I think where the Board of Deputies has been is a really good starter for 10. Can I just say a couple of other things that I'm concerned about? And there are real challenges. I'm concerned about algorithms that are frankly designed to be salacious, to divide, and to point people to this extremism. For-profit companies. I'm very worried about anonymity. And I want to understand better what the case is for anonymity, particularly on mediums like Twitter. I also think that there are real problems with social medias that promote closed group forums in which this hate can grow. And Facebook, WhatsApp are such forums in which people can be swept into this hate. And I'm thinking of young people who can be seduced because they fall down the rabbit hole of hate in a closed forum. So my own view is that in the end, these are tech companies that are very good at lobbying these days that have to be challenged. And despite their, ubiquitous nature, as it were, and overwhelmingly their base in Northern California, Seattle, parts of the American West Coast, as they come into our lives, they have to be regulated in a way that accords with our values in our community. And the standard that we have to hold them to, as I say, is a standard. You are not a thriving civilized democracy unless you are able to protect minorities. And this stuff is really serious. And it's serious for me, the descendant of enslaved people, because the consequences of anti-Black racism are real and serious. Very serious. Jewish community, because the consequences of anti-Semitism in recent modern history have been real, serious, and disastrous and catastrophic. And these legacies play on through generations. We live with the consequences of this pain and this hate. So this isn't something we take as light. It's not sort of a fringe issue. It's a central issue to the kind of democracies that we have sought to build after struggle and pain and hardship. So I stand in solidarity, and I deplored where we got to in the Labour Party. And I was very pleased to stand with you, Gillian, and others outside the House of Commons at that protest to deplore what was happening. But the truth is, it sort of continues, doesn't it? Because it continues in this virtual way. And so, you know, thank you, Marie, for what you said about these first few months under new management in the Labour Party. But until we properly address these issues nationally in terms of online harm, I'm afraid we haven't really fully dealt with it, because there will be individuals in my party that can hide out in closed forums or take anonymous identities and still spew this stuff. And that has to be challenged. Now, I ought to say two other things just briefly. Obviously, a lot of the hate that I received is also from the far right, and really worried now also about the links to terrorism that this feeds. Again, deadly, deadly serious. And the other thing that we've got to look out for in this online to harm paper is it's not, you know, we're not just standing up to people who are proximate to terrorism or proximate to awful child sex predatory behavior. We also recognize hate speech and those harms as well, and how it then can feed into things like terrorist behavior, so that we get young men seduced into extremism because they go down these silos, whether it's coming from Islamic extremism or whether it's coming from far right hatred.
Thank you very much, David. I will remember standing with you outside, literally standing with you outside Parliament at the Enough is Enough rally. And whilst it was good we were standing together, it was deeply sad that we even had to be there at all. Ruth, could you give us your response from your particular position now that you are a chief executive rather than a member of Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it should surprise nobody that I'm going to come up with a free speech line on the online harms bill, but on the other side, given the fact that I come at this from knowing that there is a problem online, and there very much is a problem that we have to deal with. My concern is how we legislate for cultural change. The reality is, as a communications platform, social media is brand new. It is a moment in history compared to how we've communicated, compared to newspapers, compared to how we have traditionally communicated, the post. And so we're still learning how it works and how we self-regulate. And what's clear is self-regulation has not really been effective. But I think we've got to look at why it is so important. And the fact is that we can't talk about legislation unless we're also talking about education. You know, I wanted every racist, and I still do, thrown out of the Labour Party. That doesn't, however, answer the question of those people are still racist, and they just now don't get to be in the club that I am a member of. We still have to deal with how with them and who they are. So from my perspective as well, I am concerned, and it touches on something that David just said, this shouldn't be a piece of legislation for Twitter and Facebook, because actually we are just as concerned, or we should be, about terrorist and extremist language on Parler and on Telegram and on some really other horrible platforms that most of us wouldn't use. So there is a free speech element to this about how we are using the social media and how we actually self-regulate and educate. The other thing, and this is my plea to the politicians on the line actually, but my plea to you is, one of the concerns I have is if we don't look at this through the wider prism of free speech, is that if you think about, there are young people who have not been able to access counselling services who self-harm during the last few months. They are using online forums to talk about their pain, probably in very explicit language, what they might have done to themselves, and online support groups as part of their own treatment. They would not be able to do so under this legislation. We could end up in a position where Facebook especially as well as it turns into a forum just for dancing cats. Because if we fine heavily, then, and especially if we go after the directors specifically, they will be so small c conservative in what they allow on the platform that they won't, that we'll just have dancing cats. And some of the positives from social media, some of the joy of social media, we'll miss. That will include children talking about what was happening to the Yazidis in Syria when they were talking about what was happening to their parents. It will include, we're talking about detail of horror that will disappear from social media. So there is a balance here, a level of nuance that should not be done, that's just a black and white issue. So from me, I think all I'm really asking for is some intellectual rigor applied. The other thing Nick also mentioned, and this will be my last point, but Nick also mentioned that it should be exactly the same on the street as it is on social media. I completely agree, which is why I'm concerned about the definition of legal but harmful. I mean, the idea that we make something illegal on social media because we believe it to be harmful, but it isn't illegal in real life, makes very limited sense to me. I understand how we've got to grade, how we've got to educate, how we've got to monitor. I just think we need to do this in a way that's informed, and not one part of this debate has currently focused on the education element. And just final comments, sorry, Gillian, I haven't stopped the politician thing yet apparently, but there is an issue here about citizenship. One of the best things that the Labour Party did was have citizenship classes when we were in government, that this government took away. But let's be clear, there is now a role for digital citizenship, how to speak to each other, how to engage with each other online. And the generation of young people that are coming through, this is their future world. So we should be instilling with them the tools to be able to move forward as digital citizens, to help protect themselves, but also to make sure that they realise that what you put up on the tweet can be harmful and bullying. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that, Ruth. Always bringing us a challenge. And I want to say how much I appreciated from Nick and David welcoming our 3 asks from the Board of Deputies, and we look forward to working with you and your colleagues on improving the situation in respect of online harms. So I now want to turn to, we've got some questions from our audience, and I'm because of the time we've got available, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but I'm going to ask a few of them, and because I know the panel between them will share out in answering them. So picking up straight away, Ruth mentioned about education. So I've got a question here from somebody with the surname Chapman in Hertford and Stortford CLP, who says, what can Labour do to educate people, including its members? It's likely that those who make death threats will be hard to reach, but because of the anti-Semitism, for example, that I see on social media, it strikes me it's coming from a place of ignorance. So perhaps if you could make a note of that question. Another question, I think you'll know the questioner, Louise Ellman, who says, Keir Starmer has made a good start in challenging Labour anti-Semitism, but how long will it take him to change the culture of anti-Semitism, often dressed up as anti-Zionism, which has developed in some constituency parties? And I'm going to put in a third question as well, if you'd like to choose to answer that or refer to it, from Joe Millis. How can you legislate to regulate companies that are not based in this country? So let me go first of all to Nick, and then I'll come back to Ruth and then to David.
If I just take those questions in reverse order, I mean, on the final point, it just reinforces with this issue of social media regulation, as with so many other issues that we face, climate change is another. We can take legislative action, but we have to act internationally as well. That's absolutely vital. We need to take best practice. We've mentioned Germany today and the fines regime. David mentioned Australia and the regime used there as well. So it is about acting ourselves, but then sharing best practice around the world. That's how we deal, I think, with international social media and internet giants. In a sense, the two other questions are related, and just saying hello to Louise as well, obviously, who's asking this question, was a quite outstanding member of Parliament. That education, we will have education programs within our party, but ultimately this all comes down to a change of culture. And there are technical and really important technical aspects to that, in the sense of having our complaints process that's fit for purpose, that is dealing fairly and swiftly with issues that arise. But it is also about the example that we all set from the top. And I think that Keir Starmer has made that strong start. I appreciate and know that we have a lot more to do in terms of changing culture in, and it's not all our constituency parties, but a number of our constituency parties. We will do that. We will do it with education. We will do it with how we enforce our rules, but we will above all do it with the strong and booming messages that we are sending from the top of the Labour Party to our members, that we want a party that is a safe space for you wherever you come from and what your perspective is. And we will be relentless in pushing that forward. We know it won't change overnight, but we will make that transformation.
Thanks, Nick. David, and I believe you also want to mention a book for us.
Well, some of these issues are explored in my book, Tribes, the underlying issues.
Book, by the way, it's an excellent book. I recommend.
Because the issues are sometimes wrapped up around identity politics, aren't they? And the way in which we can disappear into our own silo in relation to identity politics, loneliness, and why people are being seduced by these issues, but also what governments need to do to bind us together as nations. And very, very sadly, we're living in the UK at a time where, you know, ever since Brexit, but it's continuing, where we seem to be disappearing into a more divided, more fractured country. And we, you know, in the end, we want to come together. Look, I think education is very, very important. And that work has got to be, we've got to work harder on that, I think, within the Labour Party. What do I mean by that? I mean that some of the debate around Black Lives Matter is about a call for Britain to face proper education about the colonial period, about where scientific racism began in Europe and why we have this horrible pecking order of white people being preferenced over darker skinned people, why we still have statues up of slave masters and things, totally unacceptable, and why there are these tropes around in relation to Black people, around being lazy, around being stupid, around for men being sort of sexually predatory. All of those things are things that require education. And similarly, what you find in the Labour Party and those on the left of the political spectrum is that there might be some sympathy or some understanding of that, because you're talking about communities that are traditionally perceived as being underdog communities, but a total lack of understanding about the sorts of tropes that can exist for Jewish brothers and sisters. That racism could also be around, all those tropes that go back hundreds and hundreds of years that have led to people being exiled. So it does require continued education. And I would say, and I hope I can say this as a friend, that it's not just education about the Holocaust, it's actually education about the tropes long before the Holocaust that needs to be fully understood here. So I really support that point. You know, I understand, because I bothered to read about it, what Zionism is about, and about that. I think if you're, you know, I'm a Christian, I understand the exile and the way that Jewish people were treated over many years that led to a place of where is the homeland, and that desire for a homeland, And that's what it's really about. Louise, wonderful to see that you're online, and I wish you all the very, very best. But again, there is confusion about that, and it does require a sort of articulacy that we've got to be prepared to have in this new management that is in the Labour Party at this time.
Thank you very much, David. And the last word, Ruth.
If only that were always the case. There is always a problem when you are sharing a panel with two men that have written more than one book each. Because I also feel like we should get Nick's, we should do a plug for Nick's book too.
You should, great books.
It's great books. I now also think I need to go and write a book. Look, I think the education is key to all of this, quite clearly. And one of the things I am most looking forward to, now that we are under new management with new leadership, I am on message, is that we can at some point in the near future restart the JLM training. Because speaking from Labour member to Labour member, educating about the tropes and about the history of this and why it is so painful, I think is the most sensible thing for us as a socialist society to do. Louise, I love you and I miss you. I just want to say Shana Tova to you and to everybody else. And my final plug, because I can't really answer the questions in the time that Gillian has given me, is that if anyone here is interested in the EHRC report, Hope Not Hate and me as JLM have a fringe at 6 o'clock this evening on Labour Connected. And we can talk about some of this in more detail there. But just thank you to everybody for their support and solidarity, and especially to Nick and David, who between them in their roles are now adamant to fix this problem with care.
Thank you, Ruth. What a panel you've been. And we know we are in good company to be working with you all. And I thank you very much, both for your work, your commitment, your vision, and the time you've given us today. And to bring it all together, I'd like to turn to Amanda Bowman, who's Vice President of the Board of Deputies. Amanda.
Thank you, Gillian. And yes, thank you enormously to all of our panelists. It was fascinating to hear your thoughts on this issue, an issue which, as demonstrated by the discussion today, is of significant concern to us all. I'm going to carry with me the notions of Ruth carrying online abuse physically on her wrist, of David's description of cesspool silos of online hate, and Nick's comment about the urgent need for a statutory duty of care for social media users. For our own community, online Semitism is a growing problem, with figures in the UK showing a sharp increase in recent years. But of course, as we know and we've heard today, this is certainly not something limited to anti-Semitism. Bigots of all stripes have harnessed the power of social media to direct companies, often hate against others. And just as worrying, social media companies often seem uncertain or unwilling to take the action necessary to confront this hate. The Board of Deputies is determined to ensure that the current state of affairs, where British Jews are targeted both individually and as a collective online, is not allowed to continue. There are realms of evidence to show how hate speech, conspiracy theories, and other materials available online have led to radicalization and extremism of many different types. No longer can multi-billion-pound corporations be allowed to pass the buck. Over the weekend, as Ruth has already alluded to, our community celebrated Jewish New Year. I hope that in the future, we'll be able to look back on this New Year as the year in which major strides were taken to confront and defeat the burgeoning hatred which has been allowed to fester for so long. Thank you all.
Thank you.